Hi, welcome everybody. We are happy that you have joined us today for our presentation on the legal insights on the expanding use of virtual healthcare in Canada. I'm Laurie Turner, and I am a partner in the corporate commercial group at Fasken and also the co-leader of our national health law group. And today I'm happy to be joined by one of our associates, Victoria Mitrova, who I'm also happy to note has recently been named one of the lawyers to watch in healthcare law in Canada recently. Next slide, please.
Thank you for that introduction, Laurie. Before we continue with our presentation, I'll take over just to briefly draw your attention to the disclaimer that is noted on this slide. Although we're going to do our best to provide a hopefully informative overview of virtual care within the country, we do caution that the information provided in this webinar is not intended to be legal advice, and we urge that if you do have questions about the provision of virtual care in the country, that you do seek the legal advice from a legally qualified professional. Also, before proceeding with our webinar, I do want to let you know a little minor housekeeping matter that if you do have any questions at any point during the course of this webinar, you may send them to us via the chat function that I believe should be located on the right-hand side of your screen. But in order to maintain the flow of this webinar, we will only be addressing questions at the end in the remaining time. Next slide. And so as Laurie mentioned at the beginning, our hope with this webinar is to provide you with some legal insights into the virtual care landscape in Canada. As many of you probably know, virtual care uptake has significantly increased over the past few years, in no large part due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But with increases in virtual care uptake also come questions about how virtual care is implemented and regulated in the country. And so our hope today is to provide you with an informative overview of the virtual care landscape, and in doing so, to address potentially some of these questions. Today, we're going to touch upon themes including what virtual care is, how virtual care is regulated across the country, what the virtual care landscape currently is, and how it has changed over the past few years, as well as what awaits us in the future. Next slide. But before we can begin to address these various issues, we first need to understand what virtual care actually is. Now, you may have noticed that I'm using the term virtual care, but this might not be the term that you are most familiar with, because there are actually many terms that can be used to refer to this concept of virtual care being provided to a patient. Some of these terms might include telemedicine, telepractice. The title of our webinar refers to virtual healthcare. Now, all of these words, again, although different, center around this idea of virtual care being provided to a patient. And just as there are different words being used to discuss this information or these this concept, there might also be different definitions for this concept. There's no one legal universal definition for virtual care, but we do see different definitions used by regulators, governments, and research institutes, among other organizations for virtual care. And if we review these, there are some key themes that come across from all of these different organizations. Next slide. And so what you see in front of you right now is a definition of virtual care provided by the Canadian Institute for Health Information. And as I said, this isn't a universal one-size-fits-all definition for virtual care, but it does touch upon those key themes I was mentioning, which are consistent throughout the many different uses of the concept by different organizations. At its core, virtual care involves the provision of care to patients via virtual means. And so, as you see in the first definition, the first key theme is this idea of an interaction between a patient and a healthcare provider, a member of their circle of care. I want to make 2 points with respect to this idea of an interaction between these individuals. The first is that oftentimes we think of interactions as only happening in real time. For instance, when you go to the doctor's office and you speak to your physician one-on-one. But the virtual care concept includes more because it doesn't just contemplate synchronous interactions, which are real-time interactions, but also asynchronous ones. That is to say, interactions which are not in real time. It could include an email, a recorded message. The other point I want to make is that virtual care, when we speak of interactions between patients and healthcare providers, refer to all healthcare providers. I stress this because over the course of this webinar, you may notice that we speak a little bit more in depth with respect to physicians providing virtual care. But again, that is merely one type of healthcare provider who does provide virtual care. The third element that I want to focus on is that this interaction occurs remotely. So in other words, the patient and the healthcare professional are not in the same location. And that means that they can be in different cities, in different provinces, or even different countries. Another element I want to focus on is that the interaction occurs via virtual means. That is to say that it uses some form of technology. This definition specifically references communication or information technologies. There are the traditional ones that we know, such as telephone or video means, but there's also less traditional ones, emails, phone platforms, and the like. And the last element I want to draw your attention to, pardon me, is that virtual care aims to facilitate or improve patient access to care. And why this is important is because during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, virtual care uptake increased in large part because patients could not access in-person care with healthcare providers. But that's not the only means of virtual care increasing access to care, because patients may also face other barriers. For instance, healthcare conditions such as mobility issues that might limit their ability to access in-person care, or the fact that patients might live in rural areas and don't have the ability to access in-person services. And I mention this because virtual care is not a new concept that just arose as a result of the pandemic, although it certainly has increased in its uptake since then. I now turn to my colleague Laurie to speak a bit more about how how virtual care access and uptake has increased over the past few years.
Great. And first, I just wanted to acknowledge, I think we're aware that there's a little bit of feedback right now. So we are working on that, and hopefully that will tone down in a little bit. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So we're all aware that there was a huge shift to virtual care during the pandemic. By way of an example, the Canadian Institute for Health Information, or CIHI, as it's often referred to, reported that prior to the pandemic in 2019, depending on the province in which the patient was located, patients in Canada received only between 2% and 11% of their health care virtually. However, jumping then to the first year of the pandemic, this percentage increased to between 24 and 42%. So while we can all agree that there's been a significant uptake of virtual healthcare delivery since the pandemic began, there isn't consensus necessarily on the exact factors that led to this en masse shift to virtual care beginning back in 2021. I think we can all agree that the most significant factor was necessity, and what Health Canada referred to as the cost of contact analysis. And what they meant by this was that the shift to virtual care during the pandemic arose as a result of the high cost to patients and healthcare providers alike of physical interaction during the pandemic, when weighed against the perceived benefits of more traditional in-person healthcare. So as more Canadians adopted virtual healthcare, whether or not that was on account of necessity, convenience, or both, the environment for private providers of virtual care in Canada ripened. And during the pandemic, we saw a huge increase in the number of private providers of such services in the Canadian marketplace, backed by investors who look to cash in by investing in companies that provided or supported the delivery of virtual care. And by the end of the pandemic, the increased presence of privately funded virtual care technology, when paired with the publicly funded technology, meant that a large number of Canadians were able to obtain more of their healthcare online. However, as we'll discuss a bit later, and as Victoria briefly mentioned previously, the gap between those who are able to access virtual care and those who are not became the subject of concern, particularly during the pandemic, given that some healthcare services were only available by virtual means during that time. And despite all of the talk about virtual care and the pandemic, as Victoria mentioned, we also know that virtual care existed before the pandemic. I'll discuss this a little bit more later in the presentation, but I do know that pre-pandemic virtual care was less convenient oftentimes, and that it often required patients to travel to designated telemedicine sites in order to receive care virtually. So next slide, please.
Over to me. Hopefully the feedback has improved, but if not, we'll try and resolve the issues yet again on my end. In the meantime, I want to discuss a bit about how virtual care is regulated within Canada. As with other forms of healthcare, the scope of virtual care falls within the scope of practice of healthcare professionals and is therefore regulated at the provincial level. And you may be aware of this, but healthcare professionals are regulated at the provincial level by regulatory bodies established through law, with the responsibility again of regulating the practice of those healthcare professionals. Many, if not most, regulatory bodies in the province and the various provinces and territories, have established policies, standards, or guidelines with respect to virtual care. And these standards and policies set up the parameters that healthcare professionals are expected to follow when providing virtual care to patients located within that province. Although health professional regulatory bodies are one of the main ways by which virtual care provision is regulated, it is not the only way that this occurs. In some provinces, legislation also exists that refers to virtual care. For example, in Alberta, virtual care is also regulated through legislation. More specifically, the physicians regulation made under the Health Professions Act provides that the establishment of a telemedicine register, under this register, physicians who wish to provide virtual care in that province may register to provide care to patients located in Alberta. This is not the case in all provinces, but again, certain provinces do have legislation regulating healthcare. Next slide.
Thanks, Victoria. So in terms of the response from government and regulators, so as the demand for virtual care exploded during the pandemic, patients and healthcare providers looked to governments and regulators for direction and also support in responding to that demand. And again, we know that generally speaking, virtual care was not born out of the pandemic. However, that being said, it is also true that some health professionals did not use or rarely use virtual care as a means of delivering healthcare previous to the pandemic. This was the case, for example, where it was either impractical or even impossible to deliver the healthcare services virtually. We know, for example, that it's impractical to suggest that massage therapists could deliver the full scope of their care virtually. Or on the other hand, virtual care was not used when the Health Professional Regulatory College prohibited or heavily restricted the use of virtual care. So in that case, during the pandemic, the applicable health regulatory colleges were required to respond, and to respond quickly, by delivering policies on the delivery of their members' professional services by virtual means. On the other hand, the use of virtual means or virtual care in other professions, such as among physicians, was more established heading into the pandemic. For example, the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario has had a policy on virtual care since 2007. However, even if it was the case that health regulatory colleges had developed virtual care policies prior to the pandemic did spur a need to re-examine and in many cases amend those policies in order to reflect the significant increase in the use of virtual care. And particularly to reflect the fact that virtual care during the pandemic was often motivated by necessity rather than mere convenience, as it was typically before the pandemic. So interestingly, while in some cases, virtual care policies of colleges were amended and therefore loosened or were loosened to permit virtual care to be used more frequently, such as where amendments were made to policies that had the effect of permitting health professionals to deliver an increased number of services via virtual care. So there's that on the one hand, where we saw a loosening of these sorts of policies. On the other hand, we also saw that some policies of regulatory colleges became more restrictive in the sense that the amended policies that were introduced filled in gaps that existed in previous policies, and in doing so had the effect, and perhaps an unintended effect, of narrowing the scope of circumstances in which services could or were being provided by virtual means. So, for example, we saw this sort of more restrictive approach or more restrictive effect arise in the context of professionals in a province who had provided virtual care from their homes prior to the pandemic. But it was not the case that until the pandemic that the virtual care policy of their health regulatory college was updated in a manner that, again, probably inadvertently, captured non-traditional practice settings in the scope of the settings that had to be pre-approved and inspected by the college. So as you can imagine, this led to at least a temporary period where many of these professionals ceased providing services from their homes, which of course had not been inspected. We know that the college isn't inspecting people's basements or corners of bedrooms from which care started to be provided during the pandemic. And they ceased providing care because they were fearful of contravening the virtual care policy, which required inspection of premises from which professional services were rendered. And another change that we saw that occurred during the pandemic and that occurred quickly was the increasing availability of billing codes for physicians to bill the public health insurance plan for services that are rendered using virtual care. In most cases, in introducing the additional billing codes, the government emphasized that they were temporary in nature, meaning that when they were introduced, the government only made a commitment that these billing codes would be available to physicians while it was necessary in light of the pandemic. Now, however, though, we're seeing that many provinces, including Ontario, have slowly began to shift away from these additional billing codes being referred to as temporary to being referred to as permanent or being made permanent. And the introduction of these additional billing codes had a significant impact on the ability to charge privately for the physician services for which these billing codes were created. So by way of an example, in Ontario, prior to the pandemic, family physicians providing consults by virtual means were generally unable to bill OHIP for these consultations. Essentially, the virtual nature of the consults caused these services to become uninsured. And what that meant in that time period was that physicians and private providers were able to charge patients privately for these consultations. Then COVID came along, and it largely disrupted this model. by introducing billing codes for virtual consults. For example, it wasn't possible for physicians or private healthcare providers to charge for these consultations privately to the patient or their insurer or their employer without running afoul of the prohibitions on extra billing in the provincial legislation. So I will turn, next slide, sorry. So I won't talk about the resources that I've included in this slide in great detail, but I know that these two documents are examples of resources that were created by the federal government on virtual care during the pandemic. And I'm including them in the slide presentation for your reference, because I think that these documents and documents created by CIHI are really helpful tools when navigating this new world or expanded world of virtual care. Next slide.
Thanks, Laurie. As I was mentioning earlier, health professions in Canada and the provision of virtual care by these health professionals are regulated in part by the regulatory colleges established in the various provinces, and these colleges or bodies have often published policies or standards pertaining to virtual care. The next few slides will be referencing physicians specifically. And so in the context of speaking of physicians, based on this color-coded map, which you may see, in the green shaded provinces, the regulatory bodies in those provinces have published some form of standard or guidance or policy with respect to the provision of virtual care. These policies, as I said, set out the parameters by which virtual care is to be provided, or in this case, the expectation of the physician regulatory body for physicians providing virtual care to patients located in that province. Some of these expectations may include the standard of care that a physician is expected to meet when providing virtual care, the limitations on the provision of virtual care, for instance, situations in which virtual care may or may not be appropriate. And it also may place conditions on what a physician must meet before the physician can provide virtual care. For example, a physician-patient relationship must be established before care can be provided, and this requirement is common throughout most of the provinces. One of the expectations that some of these guidelines reference are whether out-of-province physicians can provide care to patients located within a province. Next slide. Now, unlike what you might have seen on the first diagram, the regulatory bodies within the provinces have varying responses when it comes to the question of whether out-of-province physicians can provide virtual care to patients located within that province. Now, I want to caveat before I go any further that the color coding on the slide, you'll see green and yellow, only relates to the stance that the physician regulatory body has in that province with respect to the provision of virtual care by an out-of-province physician. It does not contemplate potential other impediments or prohibitions against the provision of virtual care by these physicians. For example, legislation that might restrict such a physician's practice within that province. Now, based on this color coding, you may notice that 3 provinces and a territory permit out-of-province physicians to provide virtual care to patients located in those provinces, and that's Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and British Columbia, and the Yukon as well. And again, when I say permit, I only mean it in the context of the regulatory body for physicians in that jurisdiction permits out-of-province physicians to provide virtual care to patients. The other jurisdictions, which you will see are shaded in yellow, place limits or requirements on out-of-province physicians who wish to provide virtual care to patients located in those provinces. And these limits or restrictions vary on a province-to-province by basis. And it may even be that some of these limitations or restrictions are significant enough that they may severely impede or in fact inhibit a physician located outside of that province from providing virtual care. Slide. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. We've noted in conversations with clients and other interested individuals that there's often focus on certain provinces and the applicable regulatory environments in those provinces with respect to the provision of virtual care by out-of-province physicians. And so we'll be focusing on a couple of those in the next coming slides. And as you'll see, the first province we'll be looking at is British Columbia. And as you may note, by the green color in which British Columbia is shaded, out-of-province physicians are permitted to provide virtual care to patients located in BC by the regulatory body in BC. More specifically, the CPSBC, the College of Physicians and Surgeons of BC, does not require physicians to register with the college before they provide virtual care to patients located within the province. They do, however, expect physicians to be registered within the jurisdiction in which they reside or practice. And as you can see from the statement on the slide, the CPSBC also notes in its virtual care practice standard that physicians located outside of British Columbia are not subject to the regulation of the CPSBC. However, any complaints or concerns about an out-of-province physician's practice within BC may still be referred to the regulatory body responsible for governing the physician in their jurisdiction. Again, I just want to strongly caveat that when I say out-of-province physicians are permitted to provide virtual care in British Columbia, this only is with respect to the stance of the CPSBC. There may still be other legal impediments that limit a physician's practice in the province. For example, in British Columbia, there is legislation that restricts the ability of health professionals or individuals rather to perform certain restricted activities. And these restricted activities can only be performed by health professionals registered within the province. So if, for instance, a physician is not registered in BC, that physician may still nonetheless be prohibited from performing a restricted activity in the course of providing virtual care to a BC patient. Next slide. Another one of the provinces that we often find is of interest to individuals is Alberta. And unlike BC, you will note that Alberta is shaded in yellow. And that is because, unlike the CPSBC, the regulatory body responsible for governing physicians in Alberta, the CPSA, does in fact restrict the ability of out-of-province physicians providing virtual care to Albertans. In fact, Alberta, and the CPSA specifically, is one of those regulatory bodies which has recently amended its standard of practice with respect to virtual care. Before these amendments, out-of-province physicians were permitted to provide virtual care to Albertans up to a maximum of 5 times per year or in emergency situations. However, with the new changes that have come into effect, the ability of these out-of-province physicians to provide virtual care has been somewhat more restricted. Now, the CPSA requires that out-of-province physicians register with the CPSA unless the care being sought is that which is not readily available in Alberta, so for example, specialty care. If the care is being provided in the context of an existing physician-patient relationship, and it is meant to ensure continuity of care for that patient while the patient seeks medical treatment from an Albertan physician, or in emergency situations, but only where there's no other care option available. Next slide. Now I turn focus to Ontario, the most populous province in Canada. And similar to Alberta, you will see that Ontario is shaded in yellow. And that is because the regulatory body for physicians in Ontario, the CPSO, also restricts the ability of out-of-province physicians to practice or provide virtual care to Ontarians. This is a newer development as the CPSO amended their policy earlier this year to introduce these restrictions. The CPSO, under these new amendments, takes the position that physicians who provide virtual care to patients located in Ontario must be registered with the CPSO unless the provision of virtual care falls within the best interests of the patient. And some examples of best interests that the CPSO provides, again, is when the care being sought is specialty care, or again, when this care is being meant to bridge a gap between care as a person and there's already a physician-patient relationship established, or in cases of urgent or emergency situations. The CPSO also provides some additional cautionary warnings to out-of-province physicians in its virtual care policy. More specifically, the CPSO states that it may look into the practice of out-of-province physicians if they, for instance, do not meet the applicable standard of care when providing virtual care to Ontarians. The CPSO may also take disciplinary actions or may refer complaints to the out-of-province's own jurisdictional body if they do arise. And the CPSO also cautions out-of-province physicians that this best interest exception, which I referred to earlier, is not meant to be a way to circumvent the CPSO's position that physicians be registered in Ontario. It's simply a means to allow for limited ability for these out-of-province physicians to provide virtual care, but it is not to be relied upon in order to practice virtual care, mainly in Ontario, unless, of course, that physician registers with the CPSO. Next slide.
Thanks, Victoria. So now we will jump to some other considerations that arise in the context of virtual care. So first, we'll look at physician-to-physician consultations. So these are consultations that occur virtually where there's no patient present. So for an example of this is where a physician located in Canada seeks to consult with a physician located in the US in order to obtain a second opinion on a matter. And the question in that circumstance is it virtual care? Does the absence of a patient from that interaction affect whether or not that interaction is determined or regarded as virtual care? Second, we'll jump into a really important consideration, which Victoria spoke to briefly in her previous slides, as to whether or not an activity is a controlled or restricted act. So in particular, as Victoria mentioned, the fact that a telemedicine policy permits a out-of-province practitioner to provide services into that province doesn't necessarily mean that there are going to be no other restrictions on the provision of those care, or sort of the provision of that care by that out-of-province or out-of-country specialist. It might be the case that certain of the services that would be provided by that professional typically are regarded as what are called controlled or restricted acts in the jurisdiction in which the care is being provided, such that unless the professional is actually registered with or licensed by the Health Regulatory College in the jurisdiction in which they are providing care into, they're not able to actually engage in. The third is insurance. So at a very high level, we know that in the last couple of years, there's been an increased trend of litigation arising in the context of virtual care, as there's been more and more reliance on virtual care, and that increased litigation often stems from privacy concerns or privacy issues that we will talk about as a fourth consideration. But we'll talk more about the insurance that's required in order for professionals to provide services via virtual care, including whether or not, in addition to their current professional liability insurance, it's required or prudent to seek out additional insurance coverage, such as cyber insurance policies or cyber insurance policies or coverage. Next, we'll turn to privacy considerations. As you can probably imagine, we could create an entire hour-long presentation on privacy considerations arising in the context of virtual care alone. But I'm going to talk just briefly to some of the privacy considerations that should be forefront in the provision of virtual care. And finally, some ethical issues. And I include a question mark there because I think that there's really a lack of consensus as to whether or not, the use of virtual care really does create any sort of ethical issues that we should be concerned about, or that, potentially outweigh any of the benefits or a lot of the benefits that are to be realized by the use of virtual care. Next slide, please. So the first consideration, as I said, arises where a physician located in a province seeks to consult with a physician located out of the province. So as I said earlier, for instance, where a physician in one province is looking to another physician in another province or outside of Canada to provide a second opinion. And notably, as Victoria had mentioned earlier, there's a lack of consistency across Canada as to whether or not physician-to-physician consultations constitute telemedicine, meaning that there's no one definition of telemedicine or virtual care that applies nationally. And this means that some of the definitions of virtual care require the presence of a patient in order for the interaction to be deemed to be virtual care, whereas others don't include the presence of a patient to be necessary in order for the consultation or the interaction to constitute virtual care. So for example, using Alberta and Ontario. So in Alberta, despite the fact that the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta's telemedicine or virtual care standard defines virtual care as applying only where a patient is involved or included in the interaction, that policy then goes on to explicitly state that interprofessional consultations, so consultations between two or more physicians, and intraprofessional consultations, meaning a consultation between a physician and another non-physician healthcare professional, when performed virtually, is virtual care, despite the fact that a patient is not present as part of those consultations. So what that means is that in order for a physician who is located in Alberta to consult with a physician located outside of Alberta, the physician outside of the province must hold a permit with the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario or Alberta, or is providing the consultation in one of the exempted circumstances, including, for example, where the consultation that is sought from the out-of-province physician cannot be sought from a physician within Alberta on account of perhaps the out-of-country or out-of-province's physician's unique knowledge or experience, or in the case of an emergency. On the other hand, we see that in Ontario, in order to meet the definition of virtual care in the College of Physicians and Surgeons virtual care policy, it's necessary that there be an interaction with a patient. So more specifically, the virtual care policy states that virtual care is limited to a virtual interaction between a patient on the one hand and one or more members of their circle of care, which would include health professionals, such as physicians, nurses, and so forth. So that means that a consultation between a physician in Ontario and a physician located in another jurisdiction, absent a patient, is not virtual care in Ontario, as is therefore not subject to the rules and restrictions that are set out in the virtual care policy. So as you can see, this is an example of the fragmentation of the legal frameworks in Canada as they relate to virtual care, and how it's really important to be aware when physicians or other health professionals are providing services into Canada to ensure that they understand the laws and the legal framework in place with respect to virtual care in each of the provinces and territories into which they're looking to provide care, and not just make a general assumption that, you know, the laws or the legal framework for virtual care is going to be consistent nationwide. Next slide, please. So the next consideration, as I said, is looking at activities that are provided in the context of perhaps virtual care or interactions with patients more generally, and whether or not those activities are controlled or restricted acts. And this again goes back to, as I said, what Victoria briefly mentioned about the fact that just because a health regulatory college has signed off on an out-of-province physician or a health professional providing virtual care to patients within a province doesn't necessarily mean that no other restrictions apply to that care. So while the nomenclature varies across Canada, controlled acts or restricted activities, and I'm going to collectively refer to those as controlled act for the purposes of this slide for simplicity purposes, are those acts that have been identified by the province as being invasive and or higher risk, such that they may only be performed by first authorized health professionals, or to the extent permitted by the applicable provincial legislation and health regulatory college, a delegate of an authorized health professional. By way of example, the Regulated Health Professions Act in Ontario lists controlled acts as including the prescribing or dispensing of a drug, and also includes as a controlled act the ordering the application of certain forms of energy, such as MRI. So this means that both of those acts, including prescribing or dispensing a drug and ordering the application of an MRI, may only be performed by those health professionals who are authorized by their profession-specific legislation to engage in those activities, or in certain cases, delegates of those professionals. So notably, what exactly is included in these lists of controlled acts varies from province to province. But we do see that certain acts are consistently included in the list of controlled acts. For example, regardless of what province or territory you are looking into, the prescribing of drugs as a controlled act. So where a health professional is providing services into another jurisdiction, it's really crucial that they be aware of what acts are controlled acts in that jurisdiction in order for them to not engage in any such acts. And again, there's an important distinction that may exist between what activities are regarded as virtual care in a province on the one hand and a controlled act on the other, meaning that just because an activity doesn't constitute virtual care within a province does not automatically mean it is not a controlled act. So for example, as noted in the previous slide, a consultation between two physicians absent a patient is not considered virtual care in Ontario, which means that a physician who is not licensed to practice in Ontario may nonetheless participate in a consultation. And I say nonetheless, meaning they're able to participate in a consultation with another physician despite the fact that they may not, or that they're not licensed to practice or don't hold a certificate of registration with the CPSO. However, if as part of that unrestricted consultation between physicians, the non-Ontario physician engages in a controlled act, for example, by prescribing a drug for the Ontario physician's patient, they've nonetheless committed an offense by engaging in a controlled act, despite the fact that they're not offside of the virtual care policy. Next slide, please. So generally speaking, all health professionals in Canada, or all regulated health professionals in Canada, are required by their regulatory college to possess liability insurance as a condition of their licensure or membership with that college. Therefore, if a health professional is a member of a health regulatory college, then it's safe to make the assumption that they have liability insurance. But in the context of virtual care, it's also important that health professionals ensure that their liability insurance policy extends to health services provided to patients via virtual care, and more importantly, virtual care provided to patients in other jurisdictions, and if so, whether or not there are any restrictions on such coverage. And when questioning whether or not liability insurance is available to a professional in the context of cross-border virtual medicine, it's likely that our minds would turn to circumstances where the health professional is located in their home jurisdiction, meaning where they're licensed to practice their profession, and the professional provides virtual care to a patient located in another jurisdiction. However, equally as important to consider is whether a professional's liability insurance is available to the professional where the professional is located in their home jurisdiction, but is providing care to one of their regular patients outside of the jurisdiction, whether or not that patient is out of the jurisdiction temporarily, such as where the patient is on vacation, but is seeking care from their primary provider, or longer term where the patient has moved out of the jurisdiction but continues to seek care from their primary care provider. And this circumstance often arises in the context of snowbirds, where Canadians travel south of the border during the winter months, and while there seek care from their primary care providers located in Canada. Likewise, a professional must also consider whether or not their liability insurance will apply to professional services that they render when the professional themselves is out of their home jurisdiction, such as when the professional is temporarily absent from their home jurisdiction, where they're traveling for pleasure or where they are traveling for business, and during which time they're tapped to provide care to patients in their home jurisdiction. Whether or not a professional's liability insurance policy will extend to virtual care across borders depends on various factors, including who the insurer is, the exact number of services being provided via virtual care. So in some cases, insurance policies will cover out of country or out of province interactions up to a certain amount. And then after that threshold is met, the insurance coverage ends. And whether or not the professional or patient is temporarily absent from their home jurisdiction when they're engaged in the virtual care encounter. And finally, whether or not a claim is initiated within the home jurisdiction or outside of the home jurisdiction. And with respect to the question of whether or not other insurance coverage may be warranted, so obviously to the extent that it's determined that a professional's liability insurance doesn't extend to cross-border virtual care, it's going to be necessary for the professional to obtain additional liability insurance. However, even where a professional's liability insurance covers cross-border virtual care, it will also be important for the professional to confirm that the insurance that they have within their home jurisdiction, or that is required by their home jurisdiction, also meets the requirements of the jurisdiction into which they are providing care. So we know, for example, that professionals in Ontario are required by their health regulatory colleges to maintain insurance of a specific amount and of a specific nature. So a health professional who has that insurance in Ontario, who is practicing in Ontario, might think, well, I have insurance to provide cross-country or cross-border virtual care, but it might be the case that the jurisdiction into which they're providing that care, let's say Florida, requires that professionals providing care into that jurisdiction have a different insurance, whether or not it be insurance of a different nature or insurance of a different amount. So that's another really important consideration. And finally, that we know, finally, we know that for all of the advantages that virtual care presents, it also presents some disadvantages, including increased risks of privacy issues and privacy-related breaches. Therefore, dependent on the insurance held by the health professional or the organization providing or supporting virtual care, it might be prudent for them to obtain tech or cyber insurance. Next slide. So the other consideration is privacy. While virtual care has obviously provided to be very beneficial for many reasons, the use of virtual care often comes with increased privacy risk. And while there's many tools available to minimize the privacy risks inherent in virtual care, what's more difficult is changing established views among those who see virtual care as risky from a privacy perspective. And while some of the reasons why the delivery of healthcare using virtual means is riskier than traditional in-person care, some of these reasons are evident. For example, the potential for personal information or for a virtual care session to be intercepted. Other reasons are less evident. So for example, if you're thinking about privacy concerns that arise from the use of virtual care, you may not be aware that patients may be reluctant to use virtual care as they are unable to provide or unable to find a private setting within their homes or other settings from which they're taking or engaging in virtual care. So if you think about the ability of a person who lives in a bachelor apartment with no separate bedroom, with one or more persons, or a person living in a congregate care setting, it's almost impossible for those people, or it could be almost impossible for those patients to find a private setting and therefore to withhold information about their health conditions to others with whom they live or with who they reside. And so given the increased privacy risk that's associated with virtual care, it's more important than ever for professionals to seek appropriate consent from patients to the use of virtual platforms, and also consent to store or transmit the patient's personal health information across borders. And while a lot of the health regulatory college's virtual care policies touch on privacy generally and then consent more specifically, and in some cases include stringent rules in order to help decrease the likelihood of privacy breaches, how they do so really varies from regulatory college to regulatory college. So by way of example, the CPO's policy on virtual care emphasizes the needs for patients or for physicians to maintain the privacy of patients' personal health information during virtual care, and sets out steps to be taken that can fulfill that requirement, including by taking reasonable steps to identify the patient and also to disclose the identity of those persons attending the sessions, both on the physician side, such as if the physician is joined by another healthcare practitioner, or on the patient side, if the patient is joined by a family member or caregiver, for example. And in terms of inconsistency, one of the things we also see is whether or not or how colleges take different approaches to policing the use of technology in the provision of care. So for instance, in some jurisdictions, they require health care professionals, or the regulatory colleges require health professionals to use prescribed forms of technology or prescribed platforms in order to deliver care virtually. And if those aren't available or they're not willing to use that, then they can't engage in virtual care. And on the other hand, some places such as BC have emphasized that they regulate physicians and they don't regulate technology, in the sense that they leave it to the physicians to determine what technology is appropriate to fulfill or to provide virtual care while still ensuring that the physician meets their professional obligations. So next slide, please. So briefly with respect to ethical issues and other, while profit from virtual care was not a product of the pandemic, there were profits being made in the virtual care environment prior to the pandemic, as we discussed earlier. In some cases, the pandemic and the increased reliance on virtual care has led to increased profits for service providers, where patients are actually required to use virtual care, but where the receipt of those services virtually turned the service from being an insured service to an uninsured service. So what I mean by that is that where governments were slow, for example, to introduce additional billing codes for physician consults, patients in some cases were required to pay out of pocket for services that, had they been able to receive them in person, would have been paid for by their provincial insurance plan, but because they were provided virtually, were not covered. And finally, I spoke about this a little bit earlier, but in terms of ethical issues arising with respect to equity and access, well, the gap definitely decreased during the pandemic. There still remains a gap between those who use virtual care and those who do not. And this is based, for example, on socioeconomic status, with populations in low socioeconomic statuses less able or even unable, in the case of homeless populations, to access virtual care. Age, with younger people generally being more willing and able to use virtual care, and then also ability, with some technology being unusable for persons who are blind or hearing impaired. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Laurie, for that overview. As I'm hoping that all of you have recognized over the course of this webinar, virtual care in Canada has both increased in uptake, and also the technologies being used, the issues being addressed are also still ongoing, but also, of course, we look forward to the future of what virtual care holds for us. A number of organizations and entities are actively involved in examining the current virtual care landscape and seeing what innovation and new developments can be brought into this field. I'm just going to briefly touch upon two of these interesting studies. The first is a market study launched by the Competition Bureau, specifically with respect to examining the Canadian digital health sector. This market study was announced back in May of 2021, and the Competition Bureau, you may or may not know, is responsible for enforcing the Competition Act in Canada, but also for fostering innovation and enabling the provision of services and goods to Canadians. And the aim of the Competition Bureau in announcing this market study was in order to gain a better understanding of the current digital health sector landscape, but also to help the Competition Bureau anticipate impediments to innovation in this field. This market study is still ongoing. I believe at the last time that I checked, there are about 8 responses from pharma companies, the OMA, and so we look forward to seeing what conclusions the Competition Bureau makes with respect to this study. The second is that of a report of the virtual task force established by multiple Canadian organizations relating to physicians, specifically the CMA, the CFPC, and the RCFPC. And this task force report was published with the aim to provide recommendations based on physician experience and patient experience to improve access to virtual care for patients across Canada. This report included recommendations such as creating a pan-Canadian framework for regulating virtual care, as hopefully you've recognized during the course of this webinar. Currently, it is regulated provincially. The virtual task force also recommended that virtual care be covered as a provincial, at the provincial level as an insured service. And so we anticipate that this will be a point of negotiation for the various healthcare professionals and provincial governments as time goes on. And so we look forward to seeing, again, what these studies and others bring in terms of innovation in this industry and new developments as well. And hopefully in the future, we'll be able to present on those to you as well. Now, I am mindful of the time, and so although I did say that we would have hopefully some time to answer questions at the end, I am uncertain actually that we will be able to do so.
I think I might,
and
sorry,
so-
Victoria, I might jump in. There's a few that maybe I can answer really quickly and we can knock a couple off and the rest can be answered if you guys want to send us an email. So one of the questions was, can you share more about other regulated health professionals and any limitations that may exist? For example, nurses, are they able to provide care in other provinces? So yes, we focused a lot on physicians in this presentation. And the reason for that is, as we said, the rules pertaining to virtual care not only vary across provinces, but also vary across professionals. So if you think about the number of regulated healthcare professionals, you times that by the 10 provinces and then also the territories, there's a lot of different rules. But with respect to nurses, just at a very high level, I know that in Ontario and Alberta, it's a requirement that a nurse be registered with the regulatory college in those provinces in order to provide nursing care and nursing services into patients located in that province. Also, it used to be the case in British Columbia that nurses outside of BC were able to provide care into BC, nursing services into BC, as long as they were registered or licensed in their home jurisdiction. And recent amendments to their telemedicine or virtual care policy of the College of Nurses of BC has moved away from this and has required, like Ontario and Alberta, that the individual be licensed or registered within the province in order to provide care there. And then second, I'm just going to say, what should we look at for guidance of what to do when a resident of Ontario logs into virtual care from another location? So for instance, if they're on vacation in Mexico. So just quickly, I think at a very high level, there's two important things. So number one, health regulatory guidance. So the guidance that's produced by your health regulatory college within Canada, and then also the health regulatory college or equivalent in the jurisdiction in which the person is vacationing. And number two, the details of your insurance policy. I know, for instance, that the Canadian Medical Protective Association, which provides insurance to physicians in Canada, has a really great resource, a Q&A that really delves deeply into various scenarios and whether or not physician insurance would be available in those scenarios. That was quick, but we will wrap up. We're cognizant of everybody's time. So thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to any questions that you might have. And based on the feedback we received, we might also consider presenting with a focus on other health professionals as well. So please feel free to not only submit questions, but also your comments for future topics. Thanks very much.